Yes.
What is the distribution of the makeup, male to female, or and families to, you know, just generally like that?
I'm going to answer that one.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Well, we have 39 people in our family program. Typically, that looks like, what did we say, about 2.5 kids per adult. Is kind of how those numbers fall out. Then, as with the homeless population in general, there is a higher percentage of single men that compared to the women. We have 24 beds in our women's area, our women's dorm. We have, I think, twice that many in our men's dorm, and then we have a mixed level one where we kind of get to know people, and they have a few, I don't want to say less privileges, but when they move to level 2 and they're a little more stable and we know what program they're working on, then we split them up men to women. But that one, it has, I believe, 36 beds in it. And so typically our men's dorm is full all the time, the level 2. And a large portion of the level 1 mixed beds are taken by men as well. So I would, of the population that's not families, I would say a good 30 to 40% are women and the rest are men. Yes.
In the family program, are there a lot of single parents rather than couples?
She asked about single parents versus couples. We do see a certain amount of single parents, I would say. Pardon me. Right now we have, it's probably about 50-50 that are single parents versus a 2-parent household. A lot of times, you know, the one parent will be unable to work due to a disability, or, you know, due to having to stay home to take care of the children if they're under school age. But it's about 50-50 on the single parent versus 2-parent household.
And I'll also add to this on the programs for the family and children. We're really increasing this area because in the past we had our staff take kids to the swimming pool when it got warmer weather. Now we're involving the children, and we're working with KU students, civic organizations, reading programs. And why this is so important, we also will have volunteers that will work with the parents to make sure when they leave the shelter that those reading programs continue with their children, because that, I think, is a valuable education and a resource for them to do that, because kids are going to be encouraged and they're going to learn. Also at a young age, 5 and above, we've had discussions about teaching them how to get on a computer, use it correctly. And there were some schools, when I worked in West Virginia, they had computers for all elementary schools. And so I think the day and age of the computer and not the typewriter like when I grew up. And so teaching these kids when they're young and making them feel comfortable and how to get on and how to open it up and how to use it, that's our focus. We also have a stage. We're teaching kids theater and play. We're going to encourage them to be involved in programs in the high school. We had a volunteer group come down from Minnesota. They spent a week in Lawrence and they volunteered their time at the shelter. And that was one of the programs that they implemented. And the kids really had a good time with that. And you can see that they weren't sitting around and looking for something to do, but they were involved in theater play and they made it fun. So there are those kinds of programs that we want to keep everyone busy, and the objective for staff and for the guest is move them through the system so they're productive citizens in the community.
And GED programs for adults, reading programs, that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, GED programs. We have case managers and we have other outside sources that are helping with that. One of the things, one of our collaborating agencies, Salvation Army, it's about $500, $600 a month if a guest does not have a driver's license or identification, that cost to get that renewed. They've taken over that process, working with our staff and our case managers, so that's another area where the collaboration, and it's a quicker process. We just, before Tracy came on board, we had 2 case managers for 125 staff. That's not manageable. Now we have 3 for 125 and other agencies that are helping us. So you can see we're trying to, like I said, in 3 months, we've done so many changes, but I think they're changes for the good and productive. And a year from now, we'll have some statistics that will show GEDs and how many in housing, and that we've seen an increase in our housing alone just in the last month. So those things are really working. There was another hand back here.
Yeah, Stephen, you mentioned earlier that approximately 40% of the residents at the shelter have mental health issues. The
Yes.
county jail reports 60% of the inmates have similar problems. Once the 6, 9, 12-month limit at the shelter runs out, or the person's jail term is served and they're let out, where do they go? I mean, do we have enough halfway houses? Do we have enough group homes in the community to accommodate people who still have pretty debilitating mental health issues let out on the street?
There's a lot of things that factor into that. One is you may have a guest that's not taking medication. So that's a process to make sure that they stay on medication. This is how it was explained to me, and someone not in the medical field or mental illness, but it made a lot of sense. Let's say you're sick and you have the flu. Well, you go to the doctor and they give you something, take this medication, and about 3 days later you're feeling great and you're on top of the world again. A lot of people who have mental illness, they do the same thing. They've taken their medication, and they're feeling great and on top of the world. I don't need this anymore. And that's where the problem comes in, because when they quit taking it, then it kicks in all over again and a lot worse. So you got a lot of issues there. So that's part of the education, is that coaching and that teaching of, don't ever go off your medication. It's like having diabetes. You don't stop taking your insulin. You need that, and you need to monitor it that way. So that's part of it. Your question directly about where they're going to go once they read it. We're not kicking people out at 6 months or 9 months. Again, it's a process. We want to make sure what's best for that guest. We had one, I think about 2 weeks ago, that went from the Lawrence Community Shelter into the Osawatomie State Hospital. They knew that they had some issues, and they weren't getting help there, so we collaborated with other agencies to make sure that transition took place. So we're doing everything we can on that behalf.
I was just going to add to that. Of course, the Burt Nash Community Mental Health Center, they do provide case management services to folks with severe and persistent mental illnesses, which is what many of the folks in that 40 to 60% statistic would qualify for. They have what's called a homeless outreach team, who is able to work with individuals, obviously, that are homeless. And whether or not they have mental illnesses, the homeless outreach team is able to work with them, provide case management services, help them get hooked up with a lot of the same agencies that we collaborate with as well. And so in that, there is case management available to people. Many times people don't know it's there. They don't want somebody in their life. Kind of they perceive as telling them what to do, those kinds of things. So those can all be issues that are barriers to people receiving that support. But as far as the kind of halfway houses and those types of settings, group settings, there really isn't a whole lot here. I know Burt Nash runs a couple of houses for folks that have mental illnesses and have a really hard time staying stable with their medications and everything. And then most of our the typical halfway houses and things like that are gonna be geared towards people with substance use disorders, even if it occurs with a mental illness. They're really geared towards more the support around recovery and becoming sober.
Thank you.
Yes, James?
Yeah, could you go through the process of how someone would gain access to be one of the overnight guests, that process?
Sure, and Tracy, step in. In the past, and this has happened pretty recently, again, not having enough staff. Sometimes the intake would take a period of time. We have in policy now, as soon as and we had this discussion at our leadership staff meeting and our all staff meeting. Once a person comes in, we do an intake right there and we take their photo. As I mentioned earlier, all that information about that individual. And that's about a 45-minute process, and that's everybody. So if a family came in and you had 4 individuals, it's for those 4 individuals or an individual. So that's one way how we can help monitor and know who's on. And if somebody, because of policy, sex offender, we won't let them in, or other things, so we monitor that as well. So Tracy, you want to add anything?
Sure. We do, a majority of our people that are out there are self-referred. They come to our door, walk through the doors, and we sort of start them with the intake process and show them around and let them know that there will be 3 meals served and kind of where they'll be sleeping and those types of things. We do collaborate quite a bit with LMH, whether it's through the emergency room or through the people who've been hospitalized. The social workers from LMH will call us quite often and kind of plead the case for somebody if they feel like they need housing or need to come to the shelter. Also, the Osawatomie State Hospital, several of the state hospitals will, again, the social worker will call us and ask if we have room to get someone in. So a lot of social agencies, social work agencies will call us as well and ask if we have the space and if we can take an individual. So
I'm getting at something. I'm going to get something a little bit different. I live in the inner core, and I'm starting to run into lots of more homeless people. And frequently, when I'm asking them to come off of my property, the police are there to escort them off. I say, "Why don't you go to the shelter?" And I thought maybe you go through the process. And they always say, "Well, the shelter's full, or we don't want to go." You know, they have all these reasons, and it seems like there's more and more people downtown now that I used to view as being at the downtown shelter that are now on the street. I've had to have police come remove them from my properties or from houses, even, and they always say that they can't get in. And so I thought, so what's the process if someone calls? A few times I've been able to call and get someone in, but I thought I might go through that. Or what, how does the general population know, yes, we're full today, or no, we're not, we can take some people, that sort of.
We do a couple of things, and again, if we're full, we want to stay in compliance of the city and the fire marshal. And that's a good question. I mean, you may have 10 or 15 individuals out there, but also keep in mind, we're not going to turn guests away, but we're looking at, Douglas County, our donors, our funders. Tracy mentioned something about Osawatomie State Hospital. They also have to follow federal guidelines. They can't just say, okay, we're releasing this patient and we're dropping them off, or we're having a sheriff department drop them off at your shelter. They have to follow specific guidelines of a permanent address and all those kinds of things. So again, it's a lot of collaboration, but also if they're not dropped off at the shelter, that's a good, where do they go? What do they do? And so we're trying to work. I met yesterday with our Good Neighbor Committee. One of the committee members is a president of the local Homeowners Association. The other is a lady that owns land south of the shelter, and Jerry, who owns a business just east of the shelter. And I told them during yesterday's hour-and-a-half meeting that here's my vision and how we're going to collaborate and so on and so forth. And there have been a couple of calls. As soon as we get that call, we're out on that property right there. And we're going to identify and see who that individual is and take care of it then. So we're doing everything that we can, but I agree with you, James, it's still a concern. And we don't have the exact answer right now, but we're working on it.
You say that you serve 3 meals a day to everybody. That our church and many other churches support Link, downtown First Christian Church, and their census has stayed up. And I wonder if some of your clients, just to get a different venue, are coming to be fed at the First Christian Church at noon, or late noon.
Yeah. We document as much as we can. If we know that guests are working and employed, we're given 15,000 bus passes a year. We make sure that they're on that bus and they leave an hour early. So if they have to be at work at 8, they're on the bus at 7. So that's one way to monitor. And we also prepare for them sack lunches. We've had some issues where some of the guests rather not eat a hot meal and they'll take a sack lunch, and that's created problems because it left those that are working and need that sack lunch, it's left them short. So we've addressed that problem. So yeah, again, I've only been there for a couple of months, but we're trying to work on every agenda that's out there to make sure that those kinds of things, we're not preparing a meal and it goes to waste, and another resource is providing the meal for them. So.
Yes, sir.
I see that they're throwing up houses as fast as they can right up to your location. Are there any plans to bring more services out there or retail so that people can get groceries, things like that?
My understanding is, and I could be wrong on this, but on Highway 10, and I'm not sure that the last stoplight, there's a Hy-Vee or something like that going in on that corner. So it's pretty close to that area. That's something that, as a Lawrence Community Shelter staff and our leadership team, that I have in the agenda to monitor that. We don't want our guests cutting through lawns, being in the neighborhood. We don't mind if they go out and get some exercise and walk, but we don't want it where it's a nuisance for others. I've got a one-page that I started yesterday, and I'm not done yet, but I'm putting it in every bed that we have, even the family and children's area, the expectations if we continue to get calls that our neighbors are being harassed or they're lounging around or suspicious activity, and what those, and how we'll handle that. We want to make sure that they know we're aware, and we want to work with our neighbors.
Well, I'm getting the impression that you are a taking care of business kind of guy, and I hope you run out of problems and your agenda
Well,
gets smaller.
Well, let me put it this way. When I worked for the American Heart Association, I gave every staff person the goal to put us out of business. Let's find a cure for heart disease. And we lived with that every day. I asked my staff to come in with 3 goals on how they were going to do it. For instance, one staff member would say, my goal this week is to contact the research investigators to ask how much funding they need for a specific project. So it was things like that. And I think if you have an agenda and you believe in the organization, and this is the most important thing I can say, if you can invest and believe in people, and Lawrence Community Shelter, we have people, and we need to invest in those guests that we have, because if they're not going to learn it there, they're not going to learn it out in the community per se. We've got this morning we did a brief meeting on our volunteers. We're now going to interview them before they volunteer. So if they want to, one of the requirements is they got to work in the kitchen or janitorial services or mowing the lawn. If they want to do that chore, they have to interview first, because when you go out in the community and you want to do that, you have to interview. So we want to make sure that we're properly preparing them on how to interview and how to go through that process, and then we'll put the best guest in that position, and we'll keep them there for 30 days. Because we want to keep the rotation. So maybe you're cleaning the kitchen and you're learning those skills, and then next you may be janitorial skills or whatever. So that, yeah, I'm businesslike, I'm focused, but I also have the respect of the guest and you know, get them through the system so they again can be productive citizens in the community. Yes, sir.
Well, to be honest with you, this is a question you won't get very often, but in my own case, I have a part-time job that involves me to train every day when it comes in. And not very often, but several times a year, I have people getting off the train who are either coming to Lawrence for a parole hearing or to report to the parole office, or have just been released from prison, and usually not Leavenworth, Larned, or the facility at Topeka. For some reason, they send them to Lawrence with a one-way ticket, unless they, you know, been incarcerated, or still have time to serve somewhere else. I don't know what to do with these people, because they all come in with no money, of course, or most of them do. They can't afford a cab for the most time, and I have to make sure that they have transportation somewhere rather than turning them loose on the street. Do you work with either of the state prisons or law enforcement or the local parole office to provide a temporary place for these people to stay until their return train ticket becomes valid, or if not, until they can get placed in the community? I'm assuming here that whatever they were in prison for or sentenced for was not some kind of sex crime or